Hello, today's recording is regarding Chapter 27, Nutrition and Metabolism for Week 8. The learning objectives are to define both nutrition and nutrients, to discuss the macronutrients from micronutrients and the essentials from non-essential nutrients, and to explain the meaning of the recommended daily allowances, in other words, RDA. So the introduction to nutrition. Nutrition is the study of how living organisms obtain and utilize nutrients needed to grow and sustain life. Nutrients include most biomolecules, vitamins, and minerals. It's required for the synthesis of new molecules. It's required for energy, for maintenance, growth, and repair. It's obtained through food. Water is considered a nutrient, and the levels regulated during and following meals. Categories of nutrients are, first, macronutrients. They must be consumed in relatively large quantities. It's needed in daily amounts, and they include carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Micronutrients must be consumed in relatively small quantities, and those are vitamins and minerals. Essential nutrients must be obtained and absorbed via the digestive system from your diet. Non-essential nutrients are provided by biochemical processes of the body. They're not required in the diet. The recommended daily allowance, RDA for short, is the amount of each nutrient that must be attained each day. Established values of nutrients are set by federal agencies. They're originally established by the Food and Nutrition Board and reviewed and updated periodically. They're used for food planning, food labeling, and for education. In the future, the recommended daily allowance could be based on your genetic makeup. So what did we learn? We learned, first of all, to list the 6 nutrients required by your body and distinguish between macronutrients and micronutrients and what is meant by the recommended daily allowances. And going on now to the macronutrients, we hope to identify the categories that are dietary sources of carbohydrate and give examples for each category, to identify types of dietary sources of triglycerides and describe their function, to describe the sources and functions of cholesterol, to describe why protein is required in our diet and the general amount that is needed, to explain the difference between the complete protein and an incomplete protein, and to discuss nitrogen balance and include the difference between a positive and negative nitrogen balance. Macronutrients. All macronutrients provide fuel for cellular respirations to form ATP. They provide energy. This energy is measured in calories. A calorie is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 Celsius degree. A kilocalorie is 1,000 calories. 1 calorie is noted as a capital C. Body weight is maintained when calories consumed and calories expanded are in balance. So we are required to define some words. So the first word, of course, is nutrition. Is the study of how living organisms obtain and utilize nutrients needed to grow and sustain life. Metabolism is the chemical processes that occur within a living organism in order to maintain life. All the chemical processes in your body, especially those that cause food to be used for energy and growth, is metabolism. So it's all the chemical processes that occur in your body that cause the food to be used for energy and growth. This metabolism consists of anabolism, which is the buildup of substances, and catabolism, which is the breakdown of substances. Anabolism is the synthesis of complex molecules in living organisms from simpler ones together with the storage of energy. It's a constructive metabolism. So basically, it is the synthesis of complex molecules in living organisms from simpler ones in a storage of energy. Whereas catabolism is a destructive metabolism. It is the breaking down of living organisms of more complex substances into simpler ones with the release of energy. So one is storing and one is releasing. You need to know this. The other point that we mentioned earlier was this unit of energy, which is ATP. And what does that really mean? It is adenosine triphosphate. So a unit of energy is adenosine triphosphate. It is a nucleotide compound that is a critical importance for the storage of energy within cells and the synthesis of RNA. Adenosine triphosphate is short for, or ATP is short for that, is an energy currency of life. ATP is a high energy molecule found in every cell. Its job is to store and supply the cell with needed energy. So each of the components of everything we eat or we synthesize and metabolize will turn into ATP. And so we're going to talk about how each of these products are used to become a form of energy. So the first we're going to talk about is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are structurally classified as monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. When described as dietary sources, they're classified as sugars, starches, or fiber. Sugars include monosaccharides. They are glucose, fructose, and galactose. They also include disaccharides, which are sucrose, which is table sugar, syrup, or fruits, lactose, which is milk sugar, and maltose, which is found in cereals. Other sugars that are we know of are dextrose, brown sugars, honeys, and molasses. So our carbohydrates are sugars. Other carbohydrates are starches. These are polysaccharide polymer of glucose molecules found in certain foods like tubers, grains, beans, and peas. Refined starches sometimes are added as thickeners or stabilizers, such as cornstarch. As fiber is another carbohydrate. It includes fibrous molecules of both plants and animals. It cannot be chemically digested or absorbed by the GI tract. Sources of those are lentils, peas, beans, whole grains, oatmeal, berries, and nuts. So fiber is a fibrous molecule that is found both in plants and animals, but it cannot be chemically digested or absorbed by our GI tract, an important factor. Sugars and starches usually are converted to glucose. They're primarily energy supplying nutrient. Glucose is not considered essential. It can be synthesized from other monosaccharides by glyconeogenesis. Fiber serves a different purpose. It adds bulk. It stimulates peristalsis and keeps us regular, and it lowers cholesterol. So it's a really important product in our diet. So going on, the next product that we're going to talk about is lipids. Lipids include triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, and eicosanoids. Triglycerides are composed of glycerol and fatty acids. Fatty acids are organized into three categories. They are saturated, unsaturated, and polyunsaturated. It depends on the degree of saturation as to what they're called. Saturated fatty acids have no double bond. The sources are solid at room temperature. So their dietary sources are fat on meat, milk, cheese, coconut oil, and palm oil. Unsaturated fatty acids have, have one double bond. The sources are liquid at room temperature. The dietary source of unsaturated fatty acids are nuts, certain oils such as canola oil, olive oil, and sunflower oil. Polyunsaturated fatty acids have two or more double bonds. The sources are liquid at room temperature, and the dietary sources are certain oils such as soybean oil, corn oil, and safflower oil. Cholesterol is required as a component of plasma membrane. Precursor hormone for steroid hormones, bile salts, and vitamin D. It comes from the diet or the metabolism pathway in the liver. Metabolic pathway of the liver. So cholesterol is created in the liver. So this is a thing to remember, that people who do have high cholesterol, it isn't always what you eat. It could be something that is created by your own liver. The next product is proteins. Proteins are most structurally and functionally diverse molecules. They're needed in adequate quantities to replace worn-out protein structures. The amount needed depends on your age and your sex. It's more needed to fight an infection, following an injury, stressful conditions, or pregnancy. Infants and children also need more to grow. There are 8 amino acids that are essential, and the other 12 can be synthesized in the body. So there are complete proteins that contain all the essential amino acids, and generally these are animal proteins. The incomplete proteins do not contain all the essential amino acids. Generally, they are plant proteins, and combinations of dishes containing plant proteins can provide all essential amino acids. No storage of excess, so most will be supplied regularly. So basically, we can't, if you have excess, if you eat excess of the incomplete proteins, they will not be stored. So you do have to eat them regularly. If you're a vegetarian, you do not eat meat, poultry, or fish. If you're a lacto-ovo vegetarian, you don't eat animal flesh, but you may drink milk and eat eggs or cheese. Vegans do not eat any animal products. Plant-based protein sources often individually are incomplete. So most obtain their essential amino acids through complementary protein sources, and not necessarily eaten at the same meal, but regularly. Nitrogen balance. Proteins are a source of nitrogen, and nitrogen is needed for the synthesis of nitrogen-containing molecules. And what those are our DNA and our RNA and our protein. When equilibrium exists between dietary intake and loss, we have a positive nitrogen balance, absorbing more nitrogen than is excreted. This occurs during growth, during pregnancy, and when we're recovering from our injuries. So we have a positive nitrogen balance is when we are absorbing more nitrogen than we're excreting. A negative nitrogen balance is when the nitrogen is excreted more than is being absorbed. That happens when we're losing a lot of blood, or if we're malnourished, and it actually can be fatal. So the absorption of our protein is really important, especially as a source of nitrogen. And so here is a question that I'm going to be leaving with you. I want you to define what DNA and RNA are, because these are the protein is necessary in the development of our DNA and our RNA. So we need to be able to define what those actually are and what the impact on the DNA and RNA will be. So what did we learn? Well, generally, what are the functions of both sugars and starch in our diet? How does dietary fiber differ from dietary carbohydrates? What are the two primary functions of fat? Explain the general differences in animal proteins and plant proteins in terms of obtaining essential amino acids. And how may a vegetarian obtain all the essential amino acids? Now, moving on to the micronutrients, our learning objectives are going to be to distinguish between water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins, listing how both water-soluble and fat-soluble vitamins function in the body, to describe the difference between essential and non-essential vitamins, to define minerals and list examples of how minerals absorb in the small intestine, function in the body, and distinguish between major minerals and trace minerals. So vitamins. Vitamins are organic molecules that are required for normal metabolism. They're present in only small amounts of food, and they're water soluble or fat soluble, and they're either essential or non-essential. So first of all, the water soluble vitamins. They dissolve in water. B vitamins serve as coenzymes. Vitamin C is required for collagen synthesis and as an antioxidant. They're easily absorbed into the blood from the digestive tract, and they're also excess is excreted in the urine. So if they're a water-soluble vitamin, all of these things happen. They're easily absorbed, and you can't really overdose a water-soluble vitamin. Basically, if we take excess, we excrete it through the urine. A fat-soluble vitamin is dissolved in our fat. An example of our fat-soluble vitamins are vitamin A, D, E, and K. They're absorbed from the GI tract by our micelles. The excess is stored in our fat, but you may become toxic if you take too much. So these are the ones that you can take too much vitamin A, and you can take too much vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. These are important points, okay? So this is a note to remember. So some of the functions of these 4 vitamins that I want you to know are vitamin A is a precursor to visual pigment in the retina. So this helps your sight. Vitamin D, basically it helps increase your calcium absorption. Therefore, it helps in maintaining bone function and bone density. So particularly important in your senior population. Vitamin E stabilizes and prevents damage to cell membranes, so it's really important for skin integrity. And vitamin K synthesizes blood clotting proteins. So again, it helps with clotting factors and preventing from bleeding. Essential and non-essential vitamins. So our essential vitamins are necessary from diet. In other words, we absorb it. We get it from what we eat. A deficiency in intake or absorption is impaired. So where do we get it? Where would be a deficiency? It would be either vitamin C or vitamin A. Our examples are where we get a deficiency. Non-essential vitamins are cofactor body produces and recycles as necessary. So NADH and FADH2 are examples of situations where non-essential vitamins are not being produced. Minerals are inorganic ions obtained from the diet, and they're required in daily amounts. An example is iron, and it is needed for our hemoglobin to bind oxygen, and in the mitochondria, in the electron transport system, binding electrons. So iron is a really important mineral that we need to ingest, as well as calcium is required for the formation and maintenance of our skeleton and our muscle contraction, blood clotting, and our exocytosis of our neurotransmitters. So actually the electronic transmission of impulses in our body. So basically iron and calcium are extremely important minerals that we need to take into our diet. Sodium and potassium, both of them have maintain the resting potential of our electronic cells, the action potential of the cells in our heart, as well as the muscles in our body, all have action potentials. And so again, sodium and potassium. The functions of our kidney are driven by sodium and potassium. So again, those are really, really important minerals. Iodine is needed to produce the thyroid hormone, and zinc has a role in protein synthesis and wound healing. So all minerals are essential and must be obtained from our diet. We cannot get them any other way. And of course, we do take vitamin and mineral pills for those things. Major minerals, we need to have over 100 milligrams a day. If you're not getting it through your normal diet, then you should be taking medication for your diet, your vitamin pills and mineral pills, one a day pills type things. Trace minerals, you should less than 100 milligrams a day is required. Those are things like chromium, copper, iodine, iron, and zinc, and they're stored in varying degrees within the body. So an example of an iron deficiency, if you are not getting enough iron, then of course your hemoglobin may be low, or your myoglobin, and basically your electronic transport of protein would be affected. It's needed for synthesis of certain hormones and neurotransmitters, and basically it can be obtained by eating meat, poultry, fish, dark leafy vegetables, nuts, or whole grains. It is the most common nutritional deficiency that people have, and the symptoms are fatigue, weakness, pale skin, sensitivity to cold, inefficient intake of iron, and it could be caused by just simply too much bleeding, very common in women who have excessive menstrual periods. So what do we learn? We learned that vitamins can be water soluble, they can be fat soluble, we need to know which are which, and which of these groups are dangerous in excess. And what are the major minerals, and what are the trace minerals, and what two groups, how do we distinguish between these two groups? And the next one are guidelines for adequate nutrition. We need to describe my plate and what is developed by the U.S. Department of I was going to say agriculture, but it's actually the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We actually have a Canadian food guidelines that we can look at as well. This is a Canadian book, but it's odd that they're using the My Plate from the U.S. government. Identify the items that are included on the food label as well, which is really the most important thing for you to do. You should be able to explain to your clients how to read food labels, and we're going to spend a little time looking at that. So this is an example of adequate nutrition, My Plate, and the important thing for you to look at is that we really need to be eating far more vegetables and fruits than we are protein. And so that has changed significant over the last year, as you might know, and we're going to bring that up later after this PowerPoint is over. We'll talk about the Canadian Food Guide and how that has changed. So this is the most important thing, the guidelines for adequate nutrition, reading food labels. We need, first of all, when you are looking at a can or a box of food and that sort of stuff, the amount per serving, that doesn't mean that's what this is. If say this is, I'm not sure what we're looking at here, whether this is cereal or something of that sort, but the serving is 2/3 of a cup. That's not, so the serving per container is about 8. So this, let's say this is cereal, and so there's 8 servings in this container. This is, a lot of people misread these things, and they think that the container is only 230 calories for the whole container, when in fact it really is only 2/3 of a cup, and it's 230 calories. So you must make sure that the client is aware that the amount of the serving is 2/3 of a cup, not the whole container that they're looking at. And so basically, and then and for that 2/3 of a cup, how much fat is in it? So there's 8 grams of fat, and of that there's 1 gram that is saturated fat, and and then of your total daily value. So if there is always a certain amount that is recommended for an individual for the day. And so they measure this off by the day, and so that of the total daily value, what percent are you getting? So if you have 8 grams, that's 12% of what you can have in the day. And it's so the same as fiber. There's no limit to how much fiber you frankly can have, but in this case, if it's 4 grams of fiber, it's 16% of what's recommended for the day. The higher the better, frankly. Protein is 3 grams, and they did not give your daily recommended dose, but again, with your carbs, 12% of your total daily intake of carbohydrates. And so basically here's your vitamin A, 10%, vitamin C, 8%, calcium, 20%, iron, 45% of your daily dose. So it's just showing you how to aim for the recommended daily dose, basically. And so the percent of daily values is based on 2,000 calorie diet. Your daily value may be higher or lower depending on your calorie needs. So basically it can change based on your age, your sex, and your condition. So there are some changes being recommended, but this is really important that people really know how to read their nutritional values, and especially the amount of sodium. Sodium is the big killer, as you might know, the one that really affects your blood pressure and affects your kidneys. So having, getting too much sodium in your diet is a huge problem. So this one is not bad. It's only 160 60 milligrams, which is 7% of your total daily intake. But you'll be amazed at how some of the if you took the entire if you had the entire box, you would have taken quite a bit. So the main thing that we learned in this section was, I hope, was the purpose for understanding the labeling for our packaged foods. Now we're going to talk about regulating the blood levels of our nutrients, and explain what the absorption state occurs and when nutrient levels are regulated during this time, and explain when the post-absorbent absorptive state occurs and how nutrient levels are regulated during this time. The absorptive state is the time eating, digesting, and absorbing nutrients. It usually is 4 hours after a meal. The concentrations of glucose, triglycerides, and amino acids is increased as absorbed through the GI tract. Our blood glucose levels maintained within 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. Insulin is the major regulatory hormone released during the absorptive state. It's released from the pancreas in response to increased blood glucose levels. It stimulates the liver and muscle cells to form glycogen from glucose. It affects the adipose tissue. It increases the uptake of triglycerides from the blood. It stimulates the lipogenesis and inhibits lipolysis. It stimulates most cells to increase amino acid uptake, and it causes accelerated protein synthesis. The post-absorbent state is the time between meals. The body relies on stores of nutrients, and the body is working to maintain homeostatic levels of nutrients. Glucagon, is the major regulating hormone during the post-absorbent state. It's released in response to decreased blood glucose levels. It stimulates the liver to increase the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, the glucogenesis from non-carbohydrate sources, the adipose tissue to break down the triglycerides, and no effect on amino acids or proteins in the cells. So what did you learn? How does the storage of nutrient molecules change during the absorptive state? And what is the major regulatory hormone in the post-absorbent state? And what are its functions? So now we're going to talk about the functions of the liver. The learning objectives are to explain the relationship of dietary intake of cholesterol and the level of cholesterol synthesis in the liver, to define lipoprotein and provide a general overview of their function in the body, and to describe the transport of lipids within the blood, to identify and briefly describe the numerous roles of the liver in metabolism. Cholesterol synthesis. It's synthesizes by the hepatocytes. Fatty acids are transported in the blood to enter the hepatocytes. It's broken down into two carbon units, the acetyl-CoA beta oxidation. The acetyl-CoA, it produces cholesterol. Then the hemo-CoA reductase catalyzes a reaction. The cholesterol produced at basal level varies among individuals. Synthesis decreased with higher cholesterol intake and vice versa. Following its formation, it's released into the blood at very low density lipoproteins, or it's synthesized into bile salts as part of bile. 90% of these reabsorbed while moving through the ileum, and 10% is lost in the feces. So here is a pictorial of the cholesterol synthesis. You'll notice that this is our fatty acid and this is our acetyl-CoA. This is the beta oxidation area. The enzymatic pathway happens here. The decreased cholesterol in the blood results in an increase in cholesterol synthesis. Increased cholesterol in the blood results in a decrease in cholesterol synthesis. So basically, here's our cholesterol, and the bile salts actually will be excreted, some of it into the feces, and some of it will be into, can actually create calculi in the in the bile as well as in the gallbladder. Some bile salts are reabsorbed in the large intestine, and the remaining 10% is lost in the feces. Lipoproteins. Lipids with protein wrap facilitates the transport. So the chylomicrons are formed within the epithelial cells during absorption of the lipids from the small intestine. Other lipoproteins formed in the liver are classified by relative density. So we have 3 lipoproteins that we need to be aware of. There is a very low density lipoprotein which contains most of our lipids. Then there's a low density lipoprotein, an LDL, which has less lipid, and a high density lipoprotein which has the least amount of lipid. So there's 3 of them. There's a VLDL, an LDL, and an HDL. We're going to talk about each of them. So the transport from the liver to the peripheral tissues, there's the VLDLs and the LDLs are involved. The very low density lipoproteins are basically various types with protein. They assembled within the liver and are released into the blood. They circulate in the blood and are released with the triglycerides to the peripheral tissues, and they are primarily adipose tissue. With release of the triglycerides, they become low-density lipoproteins. So when these very low-density lipoproteins get released, they become LDLs. The low-density lipoproteins contain high amounts of cholesterol. They deliver this cholesterol to the cells. They bind to the plasma membrane of the cell, and they are engulfed by endocytosis. The cholesterol is incorporated into the plasma membrane and are used in certain tissues to produce steroid hormones. High-density lipoproteins are formed in the liver. These are proteins formed in the liver. They're released into the blood without addition of lipid. They circulate through the blood and fill with lipids from the peripheral tissue. Like LDLs, HDL also make cholesterol available to steroid-producing tissues. But unlike LDLs, they are not engulfed by cells receiving cholesterol. The lipids are transported via HDLs to the liver. Excess cholesterol is converted to bile salt within the liver. So again, here we have the lipid transport. These are empty HDLs, the cholesterol and triglycerides, and the VLDLs. And this is the hepatocyte. The adipose tissues actually contain the triglyceride-released form of the VLDL. And then we have the LDL, the low-density lipoprotein, and it actually has an endocytosis here. And into the relative direction of the lipid transport from the liver to the peripheral tissues and from the peripheral tissues to the liver, picking up cholesterol and triglycerides on the way. So you can see the HDL returns after picking up the cholesterol, and then the empty one goes into the system. So here we are. This is the lipid transport. So the integration of the liver structure and function. The liver is responsible for many metabolic processes. First of all, it has carbohydrate metabolism, protein metabolism, lipid metabolism, transport of lipids, and other functions such as storage and drug detoxification. So the liver has a lot of important functions. Notice the stars here. High cholesterol levels. High levels of LDL, or total cholesterol, and low blood levels of HDLs create risk factors of cardiovascular disease. If you have more than 200 milligrams per deciliter of total cholesterol, it's considered to be high. Low density lipoproteins are the bad cholesterol. High density lipoproteins are good cholesterol. If you have excess cholesterol deposits on your interior arterial walls, this is what LDLs do. And HDLs actually transport the lipid from the arterial wall to the liver, so they actually get rid of that. So you want to have high HDLs and low LDLs. Risk factors related to high cholesterol: you have high saturated fat intake is what causes it, smoking, caffeine, high caffeine intake, and stress. The treatment is statin drugs, and you can develop a low blood cholesterol, an indicator for the HGM-CoA an enzyme. It is needed for cholesterol synthesis. Sorry, I'm coughing. So what do we learn? Is cholesterol synthesis increased or decreased as a response to high dietary intake of cholesterol? Depends on the individual. What are the two fates of cholesterol following its synthesis? What molecular structure of VLDL, LDL, and HDL is responsible for transporting cholesterol from peripheral tissue to liver? And provide an example of each of the 5 categories of liver function. And then we're going to talk about the central role of cellular respirations. Describe the following nutrient molecules entering the metabolic pathway of cellular respiration for glucose, the products of triglyceride and amino acids. Explain deamination of proteins. Describe the physiological advantages of the ability to interconvert neutral biomolecules. So first of all, 4 stages of cellular respirations. The first stage is glycolysis. The second is intermediate stage. Then there's the citric acid cycle, and then there's the electronic transport system. So glycolysis is the anaerobic metabolic pathway in cytoplasm. The glucose oxygenized to 2 pyruvinate molecules. 2 ATP are formed, 2 NADH are formed from the NAD. The pyruvate converted to lactate if insufficient oxygen is available. At the intermediate stage, this and following steps, aerobic and without mitochondria, the pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA. Carbon dioxide is formed and NADH is produced. The citric acid cycle. The acetyl-CoA forms citric acid. Carbon dioxide, ATP, FADH2, and NADH is produced in cycle turn. The electronic transport system now transfers the hydrogen and electron from NADH and FADH2. ATP is formed through the oxidized phosphorylation. Glycerol and fatty acids, building blocks of triglycerides. Glycerol enters pathways of glycolysis, converting to glucose within the liver. Carbons of fatty acids removed to form acetyl-CoA. Beta oxidation. Molecules enter citric acid cycle. The amino acids may be used to generate ATP. The amine group of amino acids removed by deamination occurs within the liver hepatocytes. The amine group is converted to urea. It's eliminated through the kidney in the urine. The remainder enters the metabolic pathway at different steps. It depends on the specific amino acid, and it may enter glycolysis, the intermediate stage, or the citric acid cycle. The nutrition interconversion. Changing of one nutrient biomolecule into another. Due to biochemical pathways associated with cellular respiration, glucose is broken down to acetyl-CoA. Then synthesis into triglycerides are stored inside, entering citric acid cycle. For example, protein and fat is consumed in a low carbohydrate diet. Reversal of biochemical pathways of cellular respiration is then converted to glucose. So here is our cellular respiration, the generation of ATP molecules and interconversion of our nutrient molecules. So we're going to very slowly look at these and when we're in class, but looking at each and every one. This is your hepatocyte, and here's your kidneys, and here's your two I'm too small for me to see. And so first of all, we have our glycolysis, then our intermediate cycle, then we have our citric acid cycle, and then we have our electron transport. And we will watch a video on this. So what did we learn? When in a biochemical pathway of cellular respiration, glycolysis, immediate stage, and citric acid goes each of the following: glycerol, fatty acids, and deamination of amino acids. And how is excess sugar converted to triglycerides? And then we're going to talk about energy and heat. Define metabolic rate. Explain how basal metabolic rate and total metabolic rate are measured and variable, how they influence each other. Define the core body temperature and explain why it must be maintained, and explain the neural and hormonal controls of temperature. So our metabolic rate is the measure of energy used at any given point in time. Our basal metabolic rate and total metabolic rate. The basal metabolic rate, or BMR, is the amount of energy used at rest. Resting conditions, they must not have eaten for 12 hours, they must be relaxed, and your temperature must be about 20 degrees Celsius. Measuring by a calorimeter or a respirometer. Your calorimeter is the person is placed in a water-filled chamber. The heat released by the body alters the temperature of the water, and change in temperature is measured. The respirometer is an instrument measuring oxygen consumption. It's indirect measurement of the basal metabolic rate, and the oxygen used to produce ATP, basically ATP is used to produce heat. Your basal metabolic rate varies due to your age, your lean body mass, your sex, and the level of hormones in your blood. It decreases with age, 3% for each decade beginning at 30. A leaner body mass gives you a higher basal metabolic rate. Your thyroid hormone increases your basal metabolic rate. So if you have hypothyroidism, you have a low BMR. If you're hyperthyroid, you have a high BMR. Your body surface is important. If you're a greater surface area of skin, you have a high heat loss. If you have more heat loss, more body cells must be used to maintain your blood temperature. Then we talk about total metabolic rate. The BMR and metabolic associated with physical activity depends on several factors. The amount of skeletal muscle and its activity, so rapid exercise, food intake, the increased ingestion of a meal but a decreased absorption, or changing environmental conditions like exposed to cold temperature. Temperature hemostasis, the variable heat produced due to variable metabolic rate. The body temperature maintained within certain physiological limits. The normal value is 37 degrees Celsius. Neural and hormonal controls. Your core body temperature. The vital portions of your body is your head, your brain, and your heart, basically. The temperature is kept variably or relatively constant and maintained to allow fluctuations in the peripheral regions. Your nervous system control is mediated by the hypothalamus. Your motor pathways to the sweat glands, skeletal muscles, and your peripheral blood vessels monitors your temperature of your blood. An increase in blood and body temperature, the hypothalamus will stimulate your sweat glands to produce sweat, and it will vasodilate your peripheral vessels. With a decrease in your body temperature, your hypothalamus will inhibit your sweat glands. You will vasoconstrict your peripheral vessels, and you will induce your skeletal muscles to contract and start shivering. Behavior changes will also initiate the cortex to respond to temperature. So for example, if you start getting cold, you want to put on a coat, and if you get hot, you want to jump in a pool. Hormonal control will be mediated by multiple hormones like the thyroid, epinephrine, norepinephrine, growth hormone, and testosterone. All will have a control over your temperature. The thyroid hormone alone is the most significant. It establishes your basal metabolic rate. It raises your temperature. It drops your temperature if you're hypothyroid, releasing thyrotropin. It will stimulates the thyroid stimulating hormone of your anterior pituitary, and it also stimulates your thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. So heat-related illnesses that you can get are heat cramps. You would get involuntary muscle spasms. If you have excessive loss of fluid, you'll have intense physical activity. If you're hot, it is caused by intense physical activity in the heat and humid weather. You can get heat exhaustion. If your core temperature goes up over 104, you'll have headache, weakness, rapid heart rate, nausea, and vomiting. You can get heat stroke, which is a severe, will result in untreated heat exhaustion. If your temperature is over 104 and unable to control it, you will have fever, lack of sweating, confusion, rapid bleeding, and it actually can cause death. You can have a hypothermia where your core temperature goes under 95. Your heart rate will slow down, your breathing will slow down, you'll be confused, drowsy, and fatigued. You can get frostbite where there's actually damage to superficial cells due to the extreme cold, and the skin will go white and there will be loss of sensation. You can get dry gangrene where there is severe frostbite and that body part will become dry, lack color, and actually shrivel up due to extensive vasoconstriction of the blood vessels, and the oxygen deprived, the tissue actually dies and will actually drop off. So what did you learn? You learned that the total metabolic rate increases when you're excited, when you exit your home in a winter day. Your core temperature and what it is and how it's maintained, and the role of the hypothalamus in regulating your body temperature. And that's the end of this particular program.